Servus and hello. I am Matthias Eichler, and this is Singletrack. This is Beast of Big Creek Week. This week we race, and I am giddy, nervous too. So much still to do, to organize, to gather, purchase, and haul up to Hoodsport. But I'm ready, and will be excited to welcome you all to Lake Cushman and Mount Eleanor this coming weekend. Registration is still open until Wednesday, July 20th, midnight. If you're procrastinating, you can still sign up and join us. The race to the summit of Mount Eleanor and back for a total of 14 miles and over 5,000 feet of vert on some of my absolute favorite trails is a blast. It's hard, but amazing. I want to mention one more time our incredible race sponsors: Kevin Hayward State Farm, Wilderness Outdoor Store in Bainbridge Island, and Tailwind Nutrition. We couldn't do this without the support from our incredible partners. Okay, speaking of mind-blowing incredible things, in this week's episode, I'm taking you to one of my absolute favorite places in the world and to the trail race of my dreams. Lauren Head, Washington native and now residing on the East Coast, is joining me to share her incredible story of juggling a full-time job while racing her heart out. Lauren, lucky her, just ran the Lavaredo Ultra Trail in the Dolomites, in Cortina d'Ampezzo, along the Tres Grimas, the Lavaredo, and the Cinque Torri. Yes, she got to run this race, and I had the honor to share her story. And by the way, she didn't just run it, she came in as top U.S. woman, 13th woman overall and 153rd overall in 18, 17, and 54. Oof, that's fast. And no, she is not sponsored, not a pro. She just runs for herself, as she says, as an act of self-love. Lauren Head, thank you for coming on Singletrack. I'm super excited to have you. I've never met you. I didn't know you existed until a couple days ago when a good friend of the show, Steph Decker, posted on her Instagram that you had just completed Lavaredo Ultra Trail. This is super exciting to have somebody who's done Lavaredo Ultra Trail that's not Hannes Numberg, who wins it every year, on the show. I'm excited to hear your perspective. But before we dive into Lavaredo, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here and to be chatting with you about it.
So you are calling in from the East Coast. Where are you at right now?
Correct. I am in Washington, D.C., which, as you may know, is not necessarily known for its mountainous terrain. But I've been here on and off for about the last 6 years.
Okay, so what's interesting is if I'm sleuthing your ultra sign-up records, you've got quite a few races completed on the West Coast. So do you have roots on the West Coast, or do you just like coming out here?
Yeah, I'm originally from the Seattle area, and my folks actually live now out on the Olympic Peninsula. And then I did my undergraduate degree in BC, actually in Squamish, British Columbia. And so those are very much kind of my home trails. And so I go back and forth as much as I can, even at this point in time.
So if you say you did your undergraduate degree in Squamish, did you go to this Quest University?
I did go to Quest University, yeah. Or in its early days, I was like the fourth graduating class from Quest.
Oh my gosh. I mean, how can you not fall in love with mountain and trail running when you're like having that campus with that view in that location? I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah, it was pretty magical and pretty key into my early days of running as well in terms of those specific trails.
Yeah, for sure. Just quickly to get it out of the way, what do you do professionally out in DC?
I work in the international development and peace building space. So I work for a large international nonprofit.
Oh, fantastic. Super. That's great. Okay, let's talk about running a little bit. Give us a little bit of a history of like how you got into running and kind of some highlights a little bit so we can paint a little picture of who is Lauren.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know how kind of common of a story this is for your listeners, but I was not a youth athlete. I was not a runner in high school or college. I started running during college, when actually I went off of antidepressants, I started trail running for mental health. And then it wasn't until kind of the couple years after college, I did a few trail half marathons. And then in 2016, had moved out to DC and signed up for my first 50K. Went pretty hard and heavy early on in ultra running, did a lot of races for the first couple of years, and a lot of kind of trial and error of injury and learning how to eat and learning how to actually support training beyond just running. And then I think, like many people, have dwindled down a bit in the last few years, but I would say that the second time I went to Squamish, I did the 50-50. That was my first podium at a larger race, and that was definitely a highlight in my running career. Moved to London, at which point I was signed up for Lavaredo for 2020, and it made a lot of sense coming from London. And so then with the pandemic, obviously was kicked down the road a few times. I've battled with injuries quite a bit the last couple of years, but so this was my first time racing after having had a stress fracture last year, and to just kind of see if I can do it in a way that's healthy for my body. And thus far, it seems to have all gone really successfully. So I'm pretty excited in terms of the years ahead right now.
Yeah, this sounds amazing. So let's quickly pull back. If you say you didn't really grow up competitively running, and then you went in and did a lot of races, what was it that excited you about signing up for all these races? If you didn't come from this background of, sort of constant needing to have this competitive goal.
Yeah, I think that I maybe didn't have that in the sports space, but I did in other spaces in my life. And I also, while I didn't come from a running background, I did come from a background of growing up in the Pacific Northwest and spending a lot of time in the mountains. And so for me, having ultra running coincide with moving to the East Coast, moving to a very urban environment, it was actually a way for me in my early 20s to get outside a lot and be connecting with other people who had some of those same baseline values, which is a bit more of a niche subgroup of people, I would say, in the city that I live in now than it is, for example, in Seattle. So for me, it was just exciting to kind of indoctrinate myself in the culture of things. And then I think it's also fun to show up to 50-person races and be able to do pretty well early on. And I think that was really encouraging for me as a younger runner as well.
This is a little bit of a theme that I'm trying to hammer down on this podcast, that there are sort of two types of people going into trail running. They're the ones who did cross country or track sort of throughout all their childhood, perhaps even in high school and college, and they're sort of looking for this continuous competitive outlet. And then there are those who like the competition, but they're into trails because it gives them that feeling of adventure. They're coming from wanting to be in the mountains, and trail running in so many ways is such a great way of giving you that adrenaline kick without a huge risk that you have to take on, right?
Absolutely.
And it allows you to sort of fly down the trails, but you're not on a mountain bike and you're not like climbing, which, climbing is inherently requires a lot of skills and technical aspect and is more risky.
And I think too, requires a crew or community of people that you really trust to be both at the same level in fitness and at the same level in technical competence. Whereas I think there's kind of a lot more wiggle room in trail running, and also kind of as a woman able to just go out and do it on my own and not worry so much about company and things like that. So
yeah, that's a good aspect too, and I think that's what makes then, when you think of adventure sports, makes the races then really accessible, right? Because you can be a individual, you don't need a group of people around you. You can just sign up for a race. You can even explore different parts of the world that you've never seen before And no, yeah, sure, I'll pay the entry fee, but in exchange, I get the safety and the aid stations and the trail being marked for me. So it is a really great way of sort of bringing people not just into the sport, but just into the mountains and onto the trails, period, right?
And I think that helps to answer kind of the earlier question too of why so much racing early on, was that I didn't have to think about any of those things. I could be a learner in a really safe environment. And I think now the longer that I've run and I feel more comfortable to put together a 30-mile run for myself in the backcountry, I don't haven't had to lean on races as much for that. But that give and take is really nice, and to have kind of an environment that is set up for community members to kind of pass on knowledge and skills. That's how I learned to hike, was racing with other people and having
Right.
them tell me, like, you can chill for a little while. We've got a long ways to go. Like that was really really good for kind of me as an eager beaver.
Yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's a fantastic sort of example of how somebody gets into the sport and then finds joy. And then, I mean, that is then a little bit of a bummer that you had to deal with so much injury that sort of you had to sort of adjust your enthusiasm to match what your body was able to actually do, right?
Right, and I think that it has, at least for better, come with, now as I've become more invested in the sport and the actual athletic pursuit, I still absolutely run and love running for the adventure of it, for how it lets me be present in my body, present in nature. Um, but I've also developed more of an identity as an athlete, and I think then with that have been able to, or had a desire to put more of the time in to do all of the things, and learn about how to do all of the things that can support running. Whereas I don't think that's necessary for every runner earlier on. That's not necessarily necessary to do this sport, though it is really demanding on our bodies. And I think the conversations that are going on right now about, well, maybe it's not so much about the next race, but the next 10 years. And how do I make the sport sustainable for myself so that I can be doing it, much later down the line? Those questions just have become more relevant, I feel like.
Yeah, no, absolutely, especially because, I mean, this was for me the eye opener. And it, that or before I even got into running, I remember reading a book by Bear Grylls. He is that British adventure guy who he climbed Mount Everest when he was 23 years old. And in this book, he wrote that most people who climb Mount Everest are actually in their 50s. And there's probably a side aspect to that, which is once you're in your 50s, you weed out the people and are left with the people who have the midlife crisis and the big wallets to can afford
Right,
to go
yeah,
up there,
exactly.
right?
A little
But
self-selecting
there
there.
is absolutely. But I think there's an aspect to that was eye-opening for me, because when you come from sort of doing sports and watching sports as a teenager, you have this idea. You look at professional athletes who all retire when they're 30 years old, and so you think of yourself, well, at 30 I'm done, right? And you sort of, then it's just a slow downhill to death. And trail running and the whole world of mountain sports is, because of the less financial competitive nature of it, right, allows you to enjoy time on trail so much longer. But as you're saying, you need to make the adjustments and understand who you are and where you're at in life.
Yeah, and I don't think even in that case it's then about resisting aging or resisting your body kind of having different needs, but just learning to move with that and learning to be adaptive and kind of flexible and resilient, as those things change. And I'm saying that at 31, I think that my perspective on that will be really different in 10 years from now and 20 years from now. But that sustainability factor is important in terms of making sure that we're cultivating space to be able to do the things we love as we grow older.
Mm-hmm. No, for sure. All right, let's talk about Squamish. I mean, you went to school there. You you've seen these trails around. I haven't run a 50-50 yet. I was scared off from a 50-50, but I ran the 50K and I ran the 50 miler, and my 50 miler was actually my entry into Lavaredo, I think in 2018 or
Amazing.
so.
Yeah.
Yes, and I got selected in the lottery for the first year and was super stoked. And then personal business life situation just didn't let me allow to buy the ticket and fly all the way over and make this all happen, so I had to let it pass, and I'm still crying bitter tears. But before we get into that, let's talk about Squamish. um tell me about what makes Squamish that cool race, and especially the 50-50.
Um, Squash is such a special race. I mean, for people who have been there or who haven't been there, I still consider it one of the most beautiful places in the world. You have this very strong kind of sea to mountain feeling and atmosphere. Um, and a lot of the race is run on mountain biking trails. And so it's kind of I like to play pretend mountain biker, right? It's like super fun to be able to fly downhill, to be able to just like kind of crush a lot of technical steep downhill. That makes it different from other races that I've done, just in terms of the amount of that. And then what also makes Squamish really special is the community. I mean, Gary Robbins has done an incredible job in terms of helping to create that community, but it's like for a lot of the reasons that I think people love trail running, right? It's silly and playful, and you're going to have people out there in animal costumes and like funny signs throughout. And I think to have what is still relatively a small race, a few hundred people in each race, but just that much kind of stoke on it, and the whole community really comes out to cheer and support you. And I think there's a lot of reverence for the race out there, makes it super fun. Um, and the 50-50, I mean, the 50-50, it felt like when I was in school, it kind of felt like lore, right? Like, who in their right mind, well, this is before I was ultra running, right? Who in their right mind would run 50 miles, nonetheless, like run another 30-mile race the next day? Um, uh, and I don't know if I have much to say on it other than I mean, I did their like kind of generic training plan and woke up race day, raced the first one, woke up the next race day, and I was like, oh yeah, my body's ready to do this. And that was just kind of the first time that I had seen like, oh, training for the specificity of the race has prepared me for that. Even though this was my first time doing a lot of kind of back to back long runs and things like that. Um, it was my second year running it, so I also did the 50 miler in 2018, so I was familiar with the course. And I did it in 2019. Was the year that Jenny Quilty just like crushed the women's record, and so to be running out there with some pretty fast women too was, I think, really exciting for everybody involved.
Yeah, for sure. Do you? I mean, it is interesting because the 50-50, you speak from a local perspective how much lore there is around, but it's surprising to me that there are not more races like that.
Yeah, totally.
And right, and I wonder if it's a little bit of a marketing, or I don't know, it's a perception failure, not on Gary's part, but that we are so shoehorned into this must run 100-miler because it's such a round number,
Yeah.
that we don't really think about creative races that we could be doing. And one of the beauties of the 50-50 is you don't have to run through the night.
Yes, absolutely. And you're getting just as much kind of mileage and vertical, but you also just get to run both races faster then, right? Because you have had a night of
Yes.
rest, you have had a night of like getting as much food into you as possible, and so in some ways it comes with kind of more of a fun grind than I think a 75 miler or 100 miler comes with. Um, uh, yeah, and I don't know if we're gonna see more of that as like trail festivals continue to kind of grow as a setup, right? You're not just showing up for a one-off race, but there's kind of a whole series of events that go on. Whatever the vertical K race is, in which you can do like the 3 races in the weekend. So there are some similar things, but I can imagine that's also just like as the sport grows in the North America as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. So you came in third, but you have a full-time job, and I'm curious about the practical piece, and then about the emotional piece. So let's talk about the practical piece. So coming in third, did you really focus on trying the podium, or did you just have an incredible good day and you were just flying and then came to the finish line and were like, wait, what?
So that was actually a bit of a special year for me. I moved to London that fall to go to grad school. So I had actually quit my job in May. So that's an August race. So I quit my job maybe 4 months beforehand. And I had spent 4 months just running, surfing, and climbing and reading and eating.
Nice.
And so it was also this beautiful time of like, I will never be able to recreate that. But what I also got to see was how much work stress, how much the grind of the 40, 60, 80 hour a week, sitting all the time, not getting enough sleep, impacts our training. And that actually, if you let yourself sleep 9 hours a night and kind of rest, all of those pieces. Again, I knew I wasn't going to be able to recreate that in the future going back to work, but it was this really special cap on what had been kind of a number of months of play for me. I think it was in the couple weeks leading up to the race, I actually ended up having some foot sensitivity, sesamoid sensitivity the week of the race, and I actually didn't know if I was going to be able to race the morning of. Aside from that, though, it had just started to dawn on me, like, I actually think I could do pretty good at this. And I didn't necessarily know I could podium, but that after the end of the first day, kind of had felt really strong. And then the second day was really about holding on to that. So, but the first day I went from not knowing if I was going to be able to race, to actually having a lot of nausea all day through that race, and the worst chafing I have ever had in my entire life. It was an incredibly humid year, and having bad chafing day one of a 2-day race is really not a fun experience. But I think because of that, I was just out there to have a good time and like smile my way through it. And I think in some ways that can often be a strength, especially if you're not somebody who necessarily knows how to think competitively through a race, knows how to be strategic in that, etc.
Yeah. And there's so many things that I'm thinking about right now. There was this tweet that was floating through my Twitter feed a few days ago from one of those success coaches. And he was saying that if you look at all the successful people, then you see that they don't celebrate getting up super early. They celebrating good night's sleep, and they're successful. I'm like, yeah, right, that is true. But those super successful people, they are also professionals in many ways, and they don't have to get up early because they don't have an 8-hour job waiting for them, and they have to crank the miles out beforehand. So I think a whole causation and whatever is not really the right statement you're making here.
Also, they can take naps in the middle of the day, and just they get a culture around rest that we just, the majority of us don't get, we have to learn how to cultivate, I guess, in whatever ways we can fit it in.
Well, it makes it even more impressive that you came in third at Squamish that year, and you explained it a little bit, how much preparation time you had leading up to it. But let me ask you from an emotional side. So you come in third, and you feel good about your performance, but do you then look at this and saying, should I become a professional runner? Is there more there, or do you ask yourself, well, I wish sponsors would come knocking? Like, where are you at with that result?
I was really excited to keep running with that result. In terms of like whether or not I should become a professional runner, I have assumed that because I don't have like a running background from a young age, and because I've dealt with injury so much, that would be a really hard path for me to pursue. Um, I also love kind of my line of work, and sponsorship has never really interested me. I think that I put a lot of pressure on myself. I'm a pretty intense and competitive person with myself, and I can't imagine that like the added well, actually, no, what it really is I don't have a social media presence. I'm not like very interested in cultivating a social media presence. And with the level at which I would be performing, if I were to kind of start applying for sponsorships, it would be at least 70% social media presence, 30% kind of performance in terms of why somebody would want to invest in me. And that's just like not a lifestyle piece I think that works for me. And running is a really safe space for me. And I think that the preservation of that feels really important. But emotionally, I was really excited, and then yeah, I got into Lavaredo after that, and so in terms of just thinking bigger about races, thinking bigger about how much of my own time and kind of money I want to be investing in this, and that I think I have spent a lot of time um, feeling self-conscious about how much I pour myself into this thing when it's not what I do professionally. And like I do have running community, but most of my community is not actually focused around sports. And so I do think there are pieces of validation that come with performing well, that make it feel like, oh no, like look, rest of the world, like it makes sense that I'm actually pouring this much into it. I don't think that's right. I don't think that you need to be podiuming in order to like invest, and pour yourself into a passion or into something that makes your heart sing. Um, but but I do think there is a bit of a psychological game that does happen there, that Squamish helped to bolster, and that I've continued to try and teeter or play with in the last few years.
Yeah, that was such a beautiful answer, because I think you touched on all of the different aspects, and I kind of jumped this question on you. It's not like I asked you to prepare for this in a sense, because it is sort of a tricky question where you're right? On one side, if you want to be a professional athlete, you're essentially an influencer more than an athlete just competing. You're not like in tennis or golf where you could live off the prize money of winning tournaments, right? It would be really about how much you show your face on Instagram. And so it becomes then a completely different lifestyle. And I also like that you're saying how much running is sort of this personal space for you, and you want to preserve that. And yeah, if it becomes work, it becomes something completely different, right? The pressure to perform, the pressure to train, the pressure to stay healthy becomes a completely different beast, right? But you also speak then to that whole aspect of not necessarily guilt, but that realization, I am spending a lot of time into this, right? And this is just a hobby, right? And so to realizing how important that is for balance and what it gives you for the rest of the life, I think is fantastic. Well, all right. Let's talk about Lavaredo. I think I'm ready to jump into Lavaredo. So, was it your first race in Europe?
Yes.
No, what made you pick Lavaredo of all the races?
I wasn't ready to do a 100 miler. I knew that. I wanted to go to do something big. I wanted something where it would be a totally different experience than what I'd had in North America. I wanted something that would qualify me for UTMB. Um, but then, kind of what ended up being more important to me is my maternal grandmother's side is from that region of Italy. And so for me, I was going to be moving to Europe to have that be kind of a focal point, the opportunity to go do some reconnection with roots, to explore more of that area, and have connect with it in the way that I connect with things also felt exciting and fun. Also, having it be deemed one of, if not the most beautiful race in the world is obviously kind of a huge draw. I do not run just for the miles. I run because I love exploring epic places. So yeah, that was probably the race selection for me.
I love everything except your grandmother is pretty much exactly what has been on my mind. I had run Squamish. Squamish was my qualifier, and I wanted to do Lavaredo. And for me, it was that my family is from Germany, and the Dolomite region has always been that region where I have the fondest memory of going on vacation. These mountains are extremely special. These valleys feel exotic, but still very safe because I don't speak Italian and everybody speaks German in that area. So it felt always, I have incredible memories, and I have a specific place and I'm going to ask you about as we're going through this raid. So the other big aspect of all of this is that you didn't just run Lavaredo for fun. You came in 13th woman and first US woman, if I got that correctly, right?
Correct, yeah.
I mean, this is amazing.
I thought so too. I was very excited. My goals, my like reach goal was top 10%. Which so to come in like the top 25 maybe. So coming in 13th was really, really exciting for me.
I mean, fantastic. And I mean, extra fantastic because, we are talking again about pro versus amateur. Like, if you see Walmsley is who finally is trying to be the first American man who can win UTMB. I mean, he moved to Chamonix months in advance in order to train, right? And the average person doesn't have that luxury. And so our sort of preposition of how we roll up to the starting line is completely different from folks who do this professional. And so to perform that well speaks to how amazing you are as a runner, but it also speaks to the craziness of our sport that we still can stand. Well, right, that we can still stand at the starting line with these superstars who do nothing but train for these races, and we can still do pretty well comparatively. I can't, but you can.
Something that was really cool for me too. I think I mentioned before that this was my first race coming back from a stress fracture. In the time between Squamish and Lavaredo, I'd also had a slip disc and sciatica and a hip impingement and just like a series of problems, right? And then I moved back to Washington, D.C., which is on the East Coast, which is flat, which is humid, and took a different approach with training, actually got a coach and started cycling a lot and doing a lot of cross training in order to see like, hey, is this better for my body, right? I know that my body breaks down if I'm running 90 miles a week. Let's lower that mileage and just see what I'm capable of in kind of a more balanced way. And so to have kind of basically a test of a totally new kind of training back in a different environment, and after doing a lot of really intensive physical therapy, I was like, well, not only is this going to go for the distance, but also in terms of, like you're saying, showing up in a new environment, showing up at an elevation that I'm not used to. Luckily, the trails in Lavaredo are actually pretty similar in some ways to the Pacific Northwest. So in some ways, there's familiarity there. But yeah, it's amazing how you can kind of uh, it's not quite fake it till you make it, but it's like faking it with some really intentional sub-ins of, okay, I'm going to spend a lot of time on the Stairmaster, or a lot of time cycling, or do these specific technical days, whatever it is, to prepare for different portions of this race.
So it's fascinating that you say you gotten a coach. Give me a little bit of what was the motivation behind it if you didn't want to be more competitive, if you still only did it for yourself?
The motivation for me behind that, when I slipped the disc in my back, that, and actually the hip impingement as well, kind of gave me a a little bit of insight or taste into what it would be like to live with chronic pain. And so I told myself I had this entry. I only want to do this sport if I can do it in a way that is safe and supportive for my body. And so I'm going to throw everything I can into it in the next year, um, and make no goals for after this race until I've completed it, and see where that goes. I mean, it was also a little bit strategic to start cycling as well. I got a gravel bike that I can use kind of in a lot of different terrains to basically set up a plan B sport too, if this ends up not being
Okay.
supportive enough for my body. So that was part of the um, kind of throw everything to it and just see if it's supportive for the long term. I say that, and now I don't know if having gotten a coach to work with intensively, if I'm ever going to go back to not having a coach. Is kind of a one-way stream of investment. Of the rewards have just been incredible. And like, yeah, I'm not a professional athlete, but I do think that if I play my cards right, like I won't peak for another, 8 years or so, right? 5 years, whatever it is. And so I do still have curiosity, even if it's just for myself, to kind of see what I'm capable of. Maybe not the wisest financial decision, but there are stupider things to spend your money on. So
Thank you for being fair about this. No, this is very true, but it's also smart because I went to Europe last year and attempted a race, and I didn't get a coach, and I DNF'd. And there's always this question: well, if I would have thrown more at it, would I have been successful, right? And then you go all the way, you try everything, and then you DNF, and you have, you could have DNF too, right? I mean, it wasn't a 100% assurance, but clearly your performance and how you're feeling with your body means that it is worth the investment, as you're saying, right?
yeah, absolutely. I think that's right.
Let's talk about this magical place that is the Dolomites. I mean, how much gelato did you eat there?
I so I went for 2.5 weeks. I kind of pseudo did the thing where I was there for a full 2 weeks before the race and went all over the Dolomites, which was amazing. I only had gelato once before the race. I try to usually cut out dairy before a race. A friend was there with me for the full week before the race who had a scoop of gelato every day. In the like 3 or 4 days I had left in Italy, I think I had more gelato than she had that entire time. Just so blissfully happy.
That's the big challenge, right? You need to be there several days before the race in order to really let your body adjust from the travel and stuff. But you're so focused, you can't really enjoy the place. And then if you don't have a lot of time afterwards, then you really have to make the most of it on those last couple of days.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I will say I don't know if I can recreate this. This was about a year and a half worth of vacation saved up, but I had a full solid taper week. I had like a 45-mile week there, which was just like, yes, I didn't get to eat as many things, but I got to run a lot more in beautiful places in addition to Cortina, which if you're going to spend the money to go all the way over there, take on the ecological impact, all of those things, and especially the stress of traveling with COVID, like you might as well kind of go full force on it, I say. So definitely no regrets about taking that much time to go beforehand. Um, and especially doing it on the front hand because I was walking a little bit stiff for the few days afterwards. And so mostly just wanted to lie
Yeah.
around and eat gelato.
It's like, where is the next gelato place? That's how far I'll be able to walk today.
Exactly.
Amazing. So usually, I'm not somebody on this podcast who does like a mile by mile race report, play by play. But give us a little bit. I think we need to talk about the starting line because, I mean, Squamish is one of the biggest trail race festivals in North America, but it's like what, a fraction of the runners compared to what signs up at Lavaredo. I mean, you've got thousands of runners. What's the feeling to be in Cortina at the starting line with all of these runners?
It felt like a true festival. I mean, you had people everywhere hanging off of balconies. There was kind of music booming, people who were the announcers amping you up for a full hour. And the 120K had, I think it was 1,600 runners. So you have all those people, you have their crews. Out of the 1,600 runners, I think it was 220 women. So it's also like a very intense male energy. It was kind of definitely the most like dense situation I've been in, just with a lot of European men. But it was exciting, and I done my reading beforehand in terms of being a little bit emotionally prepared for that. But it was actually also cool then as a woman, because every time you saw another woman, there was like a sense of camaraderie of being there and being in it together. But it's also 11 o'clock at night, right? So it's a night
That's
start.
the other big thing.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's a super late night start. It's so much later even than UTMB, right?
Right. And you have to be in the corral maybe like 45 minutes beforehand or so. And then for, even though it's such a late night start, I mean, then you still have people lining the streets all through the town as you're going through up kind of to the forest. You have even people really sprinkled all throughout the forest who are still there cheering for you. So even though it has that kind of strange factor to it, there's certainly kind of equal and adequate amounts of pomp and stoke with the whole community who's there to celebrate and be excited.
Was it difficult to start at late at night? Is that like what, or do you know why they start so late at night?
I don't know why specifically 11. I mean, I assume that it is so that the top people, right? It's a top 10 podium, so that everybody's finishing during daylight still. It was also rather nice because that means the night portion, you're with people the whole time. And as I've never run a race, I've done races that ended in the dark, but I've never run through the night before. So like as somebody for whom that was my first time doing it, that was, and my first time racing in Europe and just not knowing what the signage would be like, or, any of those pieces, that was super comforting. I actually loved the night start. I thought it was really magical and special. It was interesting as somebody who hadn't raced in Europe before to just, I mean, the culture felt very different. On the one hand, you have people just yelling, "Ale, ale, ale, fatissimo, fatissimo" at you. It's just like, go, 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 faster, 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 and that's it. There's like no like, good job, you're doing great. But on the other side, for maybe the first, like none of that. It's like only like go, 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 right? On the other side, maybe for the first 40 miles, I didn't hear any runners talk to each other, which was very different than Squamish, right? It's very different from kind of the smaller local races that I do around. But because of that, you're running through the night, mostly in forest, but you're kind of coming, it's a lot by riverbanks as well, so open areas. It's totally quiet except for running, when you're not coming up to aid stations and stuff like that. And so the stars are incredible. You just have this sense, I'd spent all this time in Cortina, you have this sense of these giants of mountains looming around you, but they're not quite there yet. I don't think that my body knew what was going on for the first like 20 miles. My stomach was like very displeased because you've had a full day's worth of eating and all of those things. So and had kind of, I'm definitely a morning runner, so I'm not used to running kind of with food and stuff in my body like that. But it took 20 miles for my body to just like chill out. But it also, I think, makes it pretty easy then to take the first third of the race or so easy, and to just hike a lot, and to just kind of mentally get through the evening portion, which is probably for the benefit of really all the runners. Whereas I imagine that starting in the daytime, there's like a lot more adrenaline that would kind of maybe push you a little bit too hard in that first third. And I'm speaking as somebody who had no anticipation of being at the front of the pack. I have no idea what the front of the pack is actually thinking and whether or not they take it easy in the night. But for everybody else, I think that was in some ways actually rather helpful.
Yeah, I like it. I wonder, I've discovered that too, that people don't really talk. Do you think it's because there's so many more languages present that people are not sure if they can talk both language and culture? What's the commonality that we what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think that I can absolutely imagine that an assumption that the not all languages are going to be shared would be one piece. It's also just like I said, it's very male. It's also kind of an older group, and so as a 30-something-year-old woman, I just don't know. I eventually did make trail friends about halfway through the race, but I just don't know if there's going to be that same kind of sense of trying to create. I don't know. People just felt serious too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Whereas I'm a very smiley runner, I'm a very smiley racer, and that just like it made me feel a little bit like the odd one out in what was otherwise like a serious endeavor. But
no, it is interesting. I think that's an interesting observation because I discovered this too last year. I attempted Ultra Tour Monte Rosa 100K, and I also felt like people were more intense. And I am German, so in general, I'm trying to ignore the stereotypes of Europeans being more intense and Americans being all like bubbly. But I think on the trail there is a little bit, the way that the trail running culture has developed, there is probably some truth to that too. Yeah.
I think that there's also at least I've seen this with climbing culture in Europe, right? There is kind of a masculine mountaineering culture that approaches the mountains with a sense of almost stoicism and seriousness that I think is you can see that very differently country to country with climbing, but is certainly in stark comparison to again being the bubbly or just loud Americans out on the trail who are just like shouting their way through a good time.
Yeah. A friend of mine was just running a 200-mile race where for large portions everyone had pacers, and he told me he was so frustrated because he didn't have a pacer and he just wanted to be in his own headspace. And every time he was around other people, they all were with their pacers, and their pacers' goal was to entertain their runners. And so they were like bubble, 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 and nonstop talking. And he was like, I need to get away from these people. I just want to run.
That's fascinating. I could actually probably see that being a little bit challenging. I can maybe empathize with that a little bit, but that's really interesting. Yeah, like sometimes that's not what you need for motivation in terms of
yeah, especially if you're the one
if you're feeling bad.
Yeah, especially if you are sort of like struggling and you don't have anybody to talk to, right? And then the pacer-runner relationship also sort of prohibits you from making trail friends, right?
Yeah.
Because they are very much focused on their circle. And I'm not trying to judge that situation. I'm just sort of pointing out sort of another phenomena on the trail. All right, give us a couple more highlights from the race. You loved the night. You settled your stomach. I mean, sunrise is always magical. And you said you'd never run through the night, right? I mean, I've only run through the night with a day start, but so by the time the next day starts, I'm already so much deeper in the pain cave. But it is just magical, waking up, seeing the world wake up around you, right?
Absolutely. And the advice that my coach had given me was just get through the night, chill, don't push anything. The race starts at sunrise. So I like yes, it was beautiful and magical, and I actually got sunrise coming up to the trade team and going through that area, which is just like um, I mean, Three Peaks of Lavaredo, that's what the race is named after. It just incredible valleys on all sides. So not only do you have kind of the sun on these peaks, but you also have it shooting through these valleys and all these kind of jagged tooth peaks around you. Um, I absolutely cried actually at one point. That was the point in time in the race that I cried. They were happy tears of just how stunning it was. But then I also had this mental association of like, okay, this is where the race starts. And I during the night I had been like I started in the middle of the pack and had been like pretty comfortably passing people for most of the night, but I had hit some women with lower bib numbers, and I said to myself like, okay, these women know what they're doing. I have no, so I mean, the bibs are your assigned bib numbers kind of per your ranking, right? I have no business passing these women, and so I just stayed behind them throughout the rest of the night. And then when the sun came, let myself just kind of go as per my own body wanted to. And so that's after the first aid station where your crew is at, which is at mile 25 or 26. So I'd also just seen my crew was kind of coming up with the sunrise, and my legs were feeling really good. And then the next like 25 miles just had a blast. I ended up meeting two runners who were both much more experienced runners than me, an elite woman and then a man who lives in Chamonix. And I ran with them, or I ran with the guy at least for like 20 miles, and he really introduced me to the distance in some ways. I'd run 100K before, but other than that, all of my races had been either the 50-50 or 50 mile races. And so for me, just like getting to know, okay, what are we hiking? What are we walking? What is a good clip for, or running? What is a good clip for hiking, right? Based on this distance. After coming from Trachim, you do this long descent, and there's a bunch of flat, but you're kind of going in and out of the forest for a while until you hit another really big climb that is all exposed and hot, and that's where you start to overlap with the 80K runners. And so at that point in time, everybody's kind of feeling like crap, but you have all of the elite men and women from the 80K race who are starting to fly by, and that kind of injected a little bit more energy into the situation. And I felt great and basically had a blast until mile 55 or 60 or so. Uh, Again, I've been kind of traveling all through the Dolomites for the last couple weeks and had seen a lot of really beautiful stuff. But in some ways, and maybe this was just the high of the race, like nothing compared to the valleys that we were in during the race itself. I think in part, especially coming from North America, where um, when you're that far back somewhere, you're in the wild, right? My parents live next to the Olympics. Like as soon as you're like 10 miles from the trail, like there are cougars, there are bears, like it is there's nobody around.
You don't even have to be
That's
10
not,
miles from the trail, right? I
you know,
am in
yeah,
Olympia.
exactly. Like I
A
train
friend
bears
of mine
all of the
saw a
time.
bear a mile off his run today, starting point. So, yes.
Exactly. Whereas in the Dolomites, and I'm sure this is true elsewhere in the Alps, it is both bigger than really any, except for Alaska, maybe, really any parks that I have seen in the United States, but is also simultaneously less wild, right? There's service everywhere. you're driving, you can get kind of a cappuccino or a beer and a panini at the top of everything, at the top of like every pass or every ridge, in the middle of your hike, when even if there aren't any roads there, which is amazing. Like, I have deep respect for being able to access that much good food when you're out adventuring. But the race was kind of the first time that I felt like we were actually in some areas that felt a little bit, even if it wasn't actually that much more remote, just kind of felt bigger. Another great thing had been that it had rained the day before the race, and it was supposed to rain during the race, but it didn't. And so in the Dolomites, dust can pick up over a few days and things can end up quite hazy, but everything was crystal clear. So I just found that middle portion, things were relatively cool and gorgeous, to be a lot of fun. I had company, which, really helps a lot and kind of helps pass the hours. And then around mile 60, my stomach turned. And the last 15 miles of the race are pretty grueling. The hiking gets really steep. You've just had kind of a long exposed section, so you're hot, and I wasn't dehydrated. I drank a lot of water and was peeing a lot throughout the race. But I got really almost unbearably nauseous. And the last 15 miles were probably like the hardest 50 miles I've had of any race, just focusing really hard to keep going step by step. And it's like this one really big long climb, and then there are maybe 3 peak climbs that happen. And in that latter portion, those 3 peak climbs, I'd had a woman who's not part of the race, just like a random hiker, tell me like, oh yeah, this is the last big climb. Like, then you're 15K back to Cortina or whatever. And it wasn't true.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and it probably wasn't
so
true.
Mad. I was so upset because my brain, when my stomach went, I was still trying to get in what I could. But this was, I had 2 of my best friends come and crew me, but they're not runners. They've never crewed me at a race before. So they didn't have the experience to be like, hey, you're coming back with a lot of your food. Like, let's problem solve for you what's going on. Because my decision making wasn't that great at that point in time. And I got quite a bit of head fog and became pretty uncoordinated. And so the last maybe 10 miles of the race is all downhill. And the first 6 of that is pretty steep and technical and like kind of from Squamish. Downhill running has historically been my strong point, but I just was not able to attack that. I was really leaning on my poles. I was really like going pretty slowly, just trying not to fall on my face. And then it's like 4 miles of fire road out, which I was able to pick it up for. But yeah, that last portion was a bit brutal. I was less smiley than I maybe am at finishing up most other races.
Well, you answered what I was going to ask, which is if you took poles, which is always an interesting question for Americans because sometimes, well, at Squamish, you can't even use poles. So it's difficult to find good places to train with poles over here, aside from the fact, too, that it's a little bit frowned upon using poles. It seems like that's a Euro thing, right?
I use poles. I didn't start using poles until the halfway point. So I had done maybe 4 training runs with poles, and none of my like hard long runs, kind of usually my easier second day of back-to-backs. Just to get some practice in. I grew up skiing and actually found that like it was much more intuitive than I had thought, and I was really glad that I had them for the second half. Even just to have a rhythm with something, have something to focus on. But also, I mean, there are portions of that trail that are quite technical too, and especially going through like creek beds and stuff like that. I didn't fall, I didn't twist an ankle at any point for the race, which is like usually a given that I will at some point during a race. And I think that having poles was just a huge asset in terms of stability and all of that. But what was absolutely, you know, the awkward chick in Shenandoah, like doing repeats on a very steep, short hill, like with poles in hand, and nobody really knows what's going on. But that's fine. You just have to kind of
Put
smile, put your head
sunglasses
down
on
or
and
whatever.
headphones
Yeah,
on.
yeah, exactly.
So, that Cinque Torre area, those 5 climbing pillars, I went climbing on those when I was 15-year-old teenager, and we took the gondolas up, went climbing, and then we spent the night sleeping under the stars on some whatever field just between the main hut there and those towers. You have to give me a report on these towers, because that's the place that I'm going to start crying. I miss this place so much. I have to see it at some point in my life again.
It is just so beautiful. And I had actually gone earlier in the week, but it had been raining and overcast. And so I was like, oh, those are like cool pillars, but couldn't really see everything around there. Um, but when you're up there, I mean, everything is like being on the top of the world. Like every path that you go over, even though you're not actually on the Alpine peak, it kind of still comes with that same pleasure of you can just see valley after valley, and that's absolutely one of those areas. That is also that's like what is that? That's about the last 15 miles of the race. So that's also a headspace where like you're like, oh man, I know that I should just be so stoked on where I am right now, and it's so beautiful. But I'm in the pain cave and happier for it because of how beautiful where I am is. And that like, I mean, in some ways, I would say that the Dolomites just really hammer in how epic like that race, like what you're doing is, right? Because you're just surrounded by this awe-inspiring creations, and it really does make the whole thing just feel kind of like, I don't know, this like Lord of the Rings epic adventure, right? And I think Singletrack is one of those moments. And it's cool because even if you're not moving that fast, the 80K runners are also on the course, so you do get at least see people who are able to kind of just like cruise down to the descent to that refugio and be crushing up those all the peaks afterwards, which you can take inspiration from if nothing else.
Yeah. Yeah, when you were saying that were in a pain cave those last 15 miles, I was like, that's going to be the area that I'm going to be asking about next. So I'm going to be curious how you experienced those. All right, finish it up. Take it home to Cortina. At what time of the day did you arrive?
I arrived a bit after 5. And so it kind of nice golden light that's going on. Like I said, you have this fire road that you're running down, and then there's maybe 1.25 mile of paved road to actually make it back through the finish line. Kind of as soon as you hit that portion and you start seeing people again who are going about their days, people are stopping and they're turning and cheering for you. There's a shower to run through and like little girls handing out watermelon. And you're just I mean, I just trying to gun it through this town, gun it at like, a 9-minute mile pace or whatever felt really fast at that point in time. But the town is full of people who are kind of going about their lives, sitting, eating, and everybody turns and just starts cheering you in through the finish. And that was really special. I had, in those kind of last few miles, a woman had passed me, and then I had passed another woman. And as I was coming in, I could see that the woman had passed me, had actually just finished, and so I'd been able to close quite a bit of time with her, and was able to just like, I tried to sprint through every finish line that I can. And as soon as I was on the other side, I just started sobbing. I was just so emotionally overwhelmed, and grateful, but also done. I was like feeling pretty sick, and my stomach was having a really rough time, and so I also just like needed to be still for a while. But yeah, and my crew was there on the other side. And this was also another really cool thing for my family. I mean, this is the first race that my parents haven't been able to come to in a number of years. My parents are in their 70s. Um, and I mean, La Sportiva, they set up live tracking. So not only can they see me through each aid station, but they can actually like watch my little figure kind of along the course all the way. And then they have a live stream of the finish line and people coming through. So they were able, like, my community was able to kind of be in that moment for me or with me, which I thought was really special. Um, um, and then, yeah, and then I went and I threw up a bunch of blood, and that was really brutal. um, and that was just oh, the nausea wasn't in my head, and why in God's name do people do 100 milers? I think was my next line of thinking. Um, so yeah, that was the end of a pretty unglamorous, unshiny end. But the other thing that I'll say is, early on, I had told my crew, "Hey, I might want to know where I am ranking wise at the last aid station. I'll let you know if I do." And when I got there, they asked if I wanted to know, and I told them that I didn't. And that was a first in a race for me, where like I knew that I was just going to be doing the best that I absolutely could, like just putting out as much as I could, and I didn't want the thoughts of, right, usually I'll like keep account of however many women are in front of me or whatever. I didn't want that to be kind of poisoning, I guess, that headspace for me in those last few miles, because I knew it wasn't going to be able to make me move any faster. So I also then learned that I came in 13th. I mean, my goal time had been to come in under 20 hours, and I came in 18:17, and so it just felt awesome to and I was uninjured, and my muscles were like pretty fine.
You were just puking
I mean,
blood.
I was just puking blood, but like my legs felt good.
Nothing a few helpings of gelato can fix.
Exactly. An ample pizza.
Yeah, an ample pizza. Exactly. Wow. I mean, I love your story. I love that you were able to take us on this journey. And so yeah, take us along. I think this trail racing is that, yeah, we are competing one way or the other, and yes, we might be puking blood. There is huge suffering involved, but to be able to experience this for yourself, to own this adventure, but then to also be able to share it and inspire is amazing. Yeah, I thank you. I absolutely loved sort of being able to go along with you, and especially as a fellow runner, right? I mean, if you tell this story to somebody who doesn't run, right, you have to tell different pieces, and you get in many ways different questions and different looks, right? And you might leave out certain things. But I think that's what our sport is all about. In many ways, that's what life is all about.
When thinking about, what you were asking before in terms of like why would you invest in a coach or whatever if you're doing the sport just for yourself? I think what I was overwhelmed with after crossing that finish line was a sense of pride in having just done this for myself. Like the whole thing is an act of self-love and an act of investment and belief in yourself that, especially kind of as young women in and out of sport, we're not necessarily encouraged to do into kind of these later years of our lives. And I think having a place that you do that, having a place that's just for you, is really, really fundamentally important. And I was just grateful that I can do it in such an epic place with such a beautiful community around me.
I mean, no, it's fantastic. It's fantastic that you got to experience that and shared it with me. I feel very privileged. No, it was super cool. I want to ask what's next, but on the other side, this was so beautiful. I feel like we should just let it sit like that. More gelato, I say.
Absolutely, more gelato.
You said you're not a big social media person on purpose. Do you want to share your Instagram handle or anything with folks in case they want to connect and say hi and reach out and follow you along?
Sure, absolutely. You can find me at lore.run. It's at LOR.RUN on Instagram, and I'd be happy to chat.
Perfect. We'll have that link in the show notes. Lauren, this was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthias. I had a lot of fun, and look forward to hearing about your Lavaredo story in the future.